this webinar, which is called An Essential Leadership Skill, the latest thinking about the creative process. GERARD PUCCIO is our official presenter today. My name is Jonathan VEHAR. I am here to moderate. Denise is working the slides in the background and making sure that everything runs according to plan. As you can see on the slide, there are two pictures of us. You can guess which is which. I'll give you a hint. I'm the guy on the right. And Gerard's the guy on the left. And so I want to welcome you to the webinar. Just to sort of set up who's who and what's what, I mentioned my name is Jonathan. I'm here to just sort of moderate, keep Gerard under control, as it were.
A mighty challenge. A mighty challenge you've taken on.
So true. So my role, I'm one of the partners at a company called New and Improved. We're sponsoring this webinar. And my role is to basically work with organizations to help them create new ideas and develop their people skills for innovation leadership. And I'm going to be mostly in the background, so I want to spend more time talking about Gerard, the nice-looking guy on the left with that nice smile. And so Gerard, among many other things, is a partner at New and Improved. He is one of the people that we are fortunate enough to be able to turn loose on our clients. His full-time job, though, is the director of the International Center for Studies in Creativity at the State University of New York's Buffalo State College. And he'll talk a little bit more about that institution in a few moments. So that's his full-time job. He's a director there. He certainly teaches undergraduate and graduate courses. He's also an author of many publications, scholarly, and what's the opposite of scholarly, Gerard? Popular?
Popular press?
Unscholarly popular press.
Well, I didn't say unscholarly.
No, I'm sorry. So scholarly and popular. One of his books is right there on the screen. It's called Creative Leadership, Skills That Drive Change, which he wrote with a couple other faculty members at the center, Marie Mance and Mary Murdoch. And among other things, he is also a consultant to many businesses and organizations throughout the country and the world, indeed. So let's move on to the next slide. With those introductions out of the way, Gerard, anything I missed, by the way?
No. The only thing I would add is looking at the list of those who registered, saw a lot of familiar names. So hello to the many alumni who are tuning into this from Buffalo State, and certainly a pleasure to connect with those who have come through New and Improved programs.
Good. Many of those names I recognize as well. So a shout out to all those folks who we've met in the past. On the screen right now, it asks you to submit questions. We will reserve some time at the end, I hope, for some questions. We may fire some off along the way. And on the control panel for GoToWebinar, which you should be seeing on your screen in the upper right-hand corner, there is a box that says, somewhere that says, enter question here for staff. And if you type in your questions there, we will capture those questions, and I will fire them off at Gerard towards the end of the webinar. So if for some reason you don't see the control box, there is you might see a tiny little red box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen with a white arrow on it. If you click on that, that should open the control panel, and if you click on it again, it should make that control panel disappear. So please submit questions, and we will reserve some time at the end for that. So let's see. So with that out of the way, Gerard, I mentioned that you would tell us a little bit about the Center for Studies in Creativity. Tell us a little bit about that place where you work, direct, and teach.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll keep this brief just because we do have a good number of alumni who are certainly well acquainted with ICSE for short. So we're at Buffalo State College, which is part of the State University of New York. Our program was founded in 1967, so we've been around for 43 years, dedicated to the study and teaching creativity. Offer a Master of Science degree in creativity. Jonathan is one of our alums and a very distinguished alum of our Master of Science degree program.
Sometimes extinguished, yes.
We also have a certificate. It's a graduate level State University of New York certificate in creativity and change leadership, and that really kind of mirrors much of what we'll be focused on in this webinar in terms of connecting creativity to leadership. Because of the popularity of our graduate program, some 11 years ago, 10, 11 years ago, we opened up both of our graduate programs, the Master of Science degree and the Graduate Certificate, to distance learners, and have had 160 or so folks come through our distance program from all around the world. Yep, and we have probably now over 400 alumni. Again, Jonathan is one of our alums.
Indeed, and there are several on the phone. So great. So tell us a little bit about the flow for the day. What are you going to cover with us today, Gerard?
Well, short hour, so let me kind of block out what we're going to dive into. First, I want to set the stage in terms of life in the 21st century, and as you and I were chatting before we went live, I've been in the field now at Buffalo State College for 20 years and in the field of creativity for 25 years, and never has there been, I think, a better time to promote or to be involved in helping others to develop their creative potential. So I want to set the stage in terms of why creative thinking is viewed as a key personal and professional skill. I'm going to build off of that after we sort of set the context and go into how this influences leadership in the 21st century and how creative thinking, creative process are central to effective leadership as never before. Then that's going to lead into creative process and specifically creative problem solving and our model of creative problem solving called the thinking skills approach or the thinking skills model. And then I'm going to wrap up at the end just very quickly sharing a recent impact study we did with a multinational corporation where we've been delivering a creative leadership program. We've been doing this for 6 or 7 years now, and I want to share some of our research on that. So that's where we're going.
Sounds good. And so that's what the plan looks like. As I mentioned before, we also hope to have at the end there some time for Q&A, so please don't forget to submit those questions in the question box on your control panel from GoToWebinar. So great. So Gerard, so let's talk a little bit about some of those trends that really speak to the need for creative leadership in our current reality. What is life like in the 21st century?
Great question, and we're going to look at 3 trends. First, the broad trend. It's tossed around all the time, the pace of change, exponential increase in the speed of life. So let's just kind of unpack that a little bit and get a sense for what that actually means. So to give you some examples, borrowing from a management book published by the Open University, where they sort of quantify what's tossed around often in terms of the exponential increase in change. If you look at the 2,000 years before 1800, according to Jane Henry, management professor at the Open University, there were a total of 10 technical social inventions. These were creations that altered significantly how people lived their lives. If you look at the last 200 years, that figure doubles. So only in 200 years, there are more than 25 life-altering technical social inventions. So computers probably.
So computers will be one of those examples.
Computer, cloning, pharmaceuticals. These are changes,
telephone,
inventions.
Things like that? Telephone,
yeah,
automobiles,
exactly.
that sort of stuff?
Yeah, okay. So let's get a little more specific. So going from the broad, how has our life in general changed? Let's look more specifically in business and the organizational life. So one example of how the pace of change has impacted organizations is the shorter and shorter product life cycles. So for example, drawing from a couple of resources, manufactured products, it said, are subject to fundamental redesign every 5 to 10 years. And if you look in the high-tech sector, this is staggering. It's every 6 to 12 months, which always kills me. That laptop you just bought and pulled off the shelf is already out of date. I'm sure we've all had that experience.
Yeah, or you sign up for the 2-year plan on your brand new phone only to discover that there's one that's much cooler and much faster and much better that just came out the next day.
Exactly, exactly.
Do you have any specific examples of the changes in the workplace that we're seeing?
Yeah. So this is from Colvin's book, Talent is Overrated. He gives 2 examples. This is to kind of contrast this. He talks about, if you can imagine, at the beginning of the 1900s, for almost 60 years, Wrigley produced the same 3 flavors of gum for almost 60 years. Now, if you've gone through the checkout counter recently, especially with younger children, you know that there are a vast number and array of new gum that's available. So just an example. Motorola, I think, is an interesting example, again, pulling from Colvin's book, and I think an example of an organization that kind of found success, but then failure in some ways because of the shorter product life cycle. So quoting from Colvin, Motorola, heroic and innovative pioneer of cell phone at first, then scorned failure when it didn't jump on digital phones, then reborn champion when it created the sleek Razor, then goat once again when it couldn't produce a successor, and finally a casualty of competition when its decision to unload its cell phone business completely. So I think that's a good example of the product life cycles and how short they are, and the impact that that has on business.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the fact that just because you've got the coolest, latest, greatest thing now, innovation now, doesn't mean that that's going to be that's going to make you successful.
It's more and more short-lived. Yeah, exactly.
Good.
So kind of broaden this a little bit now, look at the changing nature of work, and I think this is one of those areas that clearly underscores the value of what new and improved does in terms of the kinds of skills that you're helping to develop in organizations, because the nature of work has changed. So in 1991, expenditures related to the knowledge age surpassed the industrial age. So a clear demarcation from industrial age to knowledge age, and now some economists argue that we're in the innovation age. Coupled with that, if you look specifically at the kinds of jobs that people are involved in, specifically you look at Richard Florida's work, he cites that in 1900, less than 10% of the U.S. population worked in creative jobs, and in 2000, more than 30% of the U.S. population worked in creative jobs. Another source that looks at this, you can sort of break out more developed countries against less developed countries. It comes from a book by Trilling and Fadel, where they talk about routine work, three kinds of fundamental work that people are involved in: routine work done by people, routine work done by machines, and creative work where the primary function is to apply imagination, create new knowledge, new products, new services, and so forth. Just an interesting way to think about where we're going as a developed country with a more and more increased focus on creative work.
Got it. So, and when you talk about creative work, you're talking about things like research and development, design, marketing, sales, supply chain management, stuff like that?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. So I alluded to earlier, this transition into the innovation age. A couple quotes around that. Jansen is an economist. I'm not going to read that. Folks can read that for themselves, but it talks about the different phases that we've gone through as a society, and he argues that we now live in an innovation age. And I'm sure many, especially those from the private sector, are sensitive to how much focus there is on innovation in their organizations. Came across an interesting statistic recently. 86% of corporations in the U.S. have the word innovate or innovation in their mission statements. In the pharmaceutical industry, 100% of those organizations have some derivation of the word innovate or innovation in their mission statement. So it's fairly clear that innovation is top of mind for many organizations.
Yeah, we see that in a lot of the organizations that we work with, and in fact, there was an organization that we worked with that they had innovation in their as one of their core values, but they didn't quite know what they meant by innovation. There's no clear definition of what that was all about. So hopefully they're listening in on this webinar, and you will enlighten them.
Well, in fact, this study published by Center for Creative Leadership put a specific number to that. When they followed up with these organizations, the 86% that have the word innovate or innovation in their mission statement, only 5% have active organizational mechanisms in place as strategies, deliberate strategies for provoking innovation. So I can put a number to your observation. So this next slide, in terms of the changing nature of work, has had an impact on the skills that are necessary for successful in work. Again, this comes from the Trilling and Fatal book on fatal. That sounds awful. That's not fatal. That's fatal. Where they're talking about 21st century skills and how they've changed from their sources. Complex communication, expert thinking, which is really higher order thinking, as opposed to linear thinking, being able to think in more lateral ways versus vertical ways, using kind of De Bono's vernacular, are on the rise versus skills that are more routine, both manually and cognitively are on the decline. So then that leads, Jonathan, to what's being touted in many sectors as a clear trend in the 21st century, and I think this is what positions the work that we do as being valuable and important. And I would say anyone listening into this webinar, if they're about championing creativity, then kudos to you. There couldn't be a better time to do this. So this is just one example. There are many reports that I have, at least a dozen reports, that all talk about 21st century skills and what does it take to be successful in the 21st century. And I have here the skills that Trilling and Fatal talk about. You can see there's an entire cluster they call learning and innovation skills, which includes problem solving, creativity, and innovation. If you look further down under their category, career and life skills, you see some skills, especially flexibility and adaptability, that are easily connected to what creative thinking is all about. And obviously leadership we'll be talking about more in this webinar, and how creative thinking and the creative process supports that. So a quote around that. This comes from one of those other reports that underscores creative thinking, innovation, 21st century skills, a book called Tough Choices or Tough Times. This quote I will read because I do like the quote so much. So, creativity, innovation, and flexibility will not be the special province of an elite. It will be demanded of virtually everyone who's making a decent living, from graphic artists to assembly line workers, from insurance brokers to home builders. So the point there is, given what we just went through in setting the stage and the complexity, the nature of the challenges that we face, and the fact that they take multidisciplinary approaches, that past solutions are often not successful for everyone across sectors, creative thinking is becoming a premium skill.
Isn't that interesting, that listing at the end of that quote? You know, just everything from sort of what we think as traditional creative thinkers, graphic artists, for example, to those folks that we think of as, you know, sort of routine work, which is even the routine work is now becoming not routine, and there's a huge need for creativity and innovation in those roles.
Yeah, great observation. Yeah, excellent observation.
So that's kind of so what are the implications then of all this change for our thinking skills? Well, I guess the question is sort of what's really needed right now that's not there.
Okay. Well, there's a serious gap. So when we look at the importance of creative thinking to be successful in your job, and then we look broader in terms of this innovation age. One of the, and I kind of refer to this as the perfect storm, one of the dilemmas is this. This slide that you're looking at was a study done by the Society for Human Resource Management in conjunction with the conference board. So they asked human resource managers, if you're looking at a new entrant into your organization, what are the top skills that you're looking for? And they called that the applied skill set, and you can see that list there. Now, here's the thing, not surprisingly, creativity was on that list. But they went further and they said, now, how well, this is important to you. You see this as being critical for success in your organization. How well prepared are you to develop this skill, to foster this skill? And I have these now ranked by percentage in terms of how many of those interviewed, these HR managers, said they were not well prepared to develop this. So there, in other words, there's the gap between this as a high need and how well they can provide for it. And creativity was top of the list. Almost 70% of those who were interviewed for this said that, yes, it's important. We really need this. We want folks to be able to think creatively and use their imaginations. is to set the stage for why I'm excited, why I've been so busy, is that there's a greater recognition. Jonathan, maybe you've had this experience more and more when I sit on that, the airplane next to someone, and we get into that conversation. They say, "Oh, Gerard, what do you do for a living?" And I say, "I teach and research creativity," where I used to be laughed at, or "What is that?" Or they, turn their shoulder to me.
Right. Or they thought that you were talking about poetry or writing songs,
right.
or something.
Yeah,
like
sort of
that.
the classic. Yeah, more and more folks are saying to me, "Wow, that's really interesting," or my company is into that, or I met someone recently on a flight to Buenos Aires who works for Chanel in the HR area, and they actually, when they're doing interviews, have creativity simulations that they put the prospective hires through as part of the process. So, more and more there's that recognition of the importance. So, how does that set us up more specifically in terms of leadership in the 21st century? I'm not going to read this, but it's short. Folks can read it for themselves. This comes from Lee Iacocca. So here you see the connection between change and the role of leaders. So that brings us to a study. I think, Jonathan, you know a bit about this study.
We have been reading the CEO study and blogging about it on our innovation blog site on a fairly regular basis, because it's pointing out the need that, that old command and control model, not necessarily as effective as one might think. And in fact, there are lots of people who you'd think would be doing command and control who are saying that's not working.
Right. Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the traditional views of leadership are giving way to, and the IBM study really is the exclamation point behind it. And I have it. I can share it with you, Jonathan, and you can share it with anyone who's interested, who's listening in. But it was a study done of 1,555, I think, executives around the world. And IBM does this every couple years, where they try to get the pulse on what's going on inside of organizations, what's viewed as being important for success over the next 3 to 5 years. So essentially, that was the question that was put to these CEOs. And this is one of the quotes out of that study. So the CEOs told us that they operate in a world that's substantially more volatile, uncertain, and complex. And in fact, when they asked the CEOs what they predict for the future, when they summed this up, the CEO said it was going to become even more complex. In fact, a 32%, to put a specific number to it, 32% increase in complexity. So many share the view that incremental changes are no longer sufficient in a world that's operating in fundamentally different ways. And those who are listening in that are familiar with the Foresight tool, a measure we use to look at creativity styles, we recently did an analysis of 7,000 people who completed Foresight. We looked at hierarchy within the organization, and on one of 4 areas in terms of thinking styles, one of 4 areas we found a significant difference, with the senior people showing higher levels of ideation versus clarification, development, which is kind of evaluating, and implementation. That was the only one where we saw statistically significant differences, again, with senior positions having higher scores on ideation. So I think that kind of corresponds to the IBM study, where they concluded that creativity going forward is the most important leadership quality. And now, why is that? Looking at Michael Mumford's work, he says that what leaders do, the success of leadership essentially comes down to whether leaders are able to solve complex problems, complex social problems, which are defined or described as being ill-defined, meaning there's no single solution path, any number of right answers, where imagination is really critical, which then leads into the second quality, where past experience and knowledge is not sufficient because the circumstances are changing so quickly, simply can't lean on past solutions, plug and play, pull it out, and plug it into the present situation. And more leaders are faced with very ambiguous situations, where there's gaps in information, or there's plenty of information, and diagnosis is required to discover what's relevant. And what that means is that leaders are more and more creative problem solvers, creative thinkers. They have to embrace the creative process, for example, that New and Improved teaches. So from Mumford, who's done some fantastic research, longitudinal research. He says the available evidence indicates that creative problem solving may indeed represent an important influence on leader performance. So that doesn't necessarily imply that the leader has to come up with all the creative solutions, but you talked about command and control and traditional approaches to leadership. Certainly leaders, if they're not applying their imaginations, at least need to be effective in drawing ideas out of others and helping others to apply their imaginations to help the team or the organization solve its own problems or solve its customers' problems. So here's our definition of leadership. We're sorting an ambitious goal, try to carve out creative leadership as its own construct within the field of leadership studies. So we're describing creative leadership, and I won't dwell on this a lot, but just to differentiate it from sort of the traditional view of leadership. So it's the ability to deliberately engage one's imagination to define and guide a group towards a novel goal. So to intentionally pursue change, to intentionally pursue something new. This is a direction that is new for the group. And as a consequence, of bringing about this creative change, small point here, not all change is creative. Changing the baby is not terribly creative, or changing your tire is not terribly creative. You know how to do it. But creative change is where we're bringing in a novel solution or going after a new opportunity. So there's something new there. Either the solution's new and you're reacting to a predicament, but it's a new way of solving that, or it's a new market, new business model that you're creating, for example. And as a result of that, creative leaders have a profoundly positive influence on their context. They improve the workplace in terms of reinforcing a creative work climate, culture. That could also be in the community, school, or in the family, and then have a positive impact on individuals in that situation.
Okay. Now, if there was negative influence on the context, would they still be creative leaders, or would they just be ineffective creative leaders?
Well, we're looking at, when we think about change, we're looking at having a positive effect, you know, where you're solving, you're adding value. If you go back to the classic definition of creativity, it's creating something new that adds value or has some benefit. So, yeah, just to avoid the argument that there are some leaders out there who are creating new things, but it's having a negative impact. Yeah.
Very good.
So, hey, that brings us to creative problem solving and the thinking skills model. So just to connect the dots, in the 21st century, being a creative leader is necessary for success, both personally and for the team or the organization. Creative problem solving is quickly becoming a core leadership skill, generically speaking, but what can you specifically do to develop creative problem solving skills? And that brings us to your work.
Very good. So, well, not so much our work, but sort of our articulation of this. So, so traditionally, there's been a lot of talk about either what you might call creative problem solving or creative process, and there's a lot of different articulations of the work that was really pioneered by Alex Osborne and Sid Parnes, through their work at Buff State or the Center for, or the Creative Education Foundation. This is our articulation of the creative process that they really developed. 6 fundamental steps. It's about identifying a goal or wish. Where do we want to begin our efforts? What's the data? Gathering some data around that to really understand what's happening. Clarifying the challenge. What is it that we specifically want to work on when we start to generate ideas? Once we've generated those ideas, we start to select and strengthen solutions, and then we create a plan for action. And there are a lot of varieties and variations on this. We sort of teach it, those steps 1 through 6. And in practice, the way that we articulate it, at least, is sort of what we call a hub and spoke, which is, you start in the center by diagnosing where are you in the process, what do you need, what needs to actually happen. And in practice, that's when you determine whether or not you start by identifying a goal, wish, challenge, which in a linear framework is sort of the first step in the process, or whether you start with a plan of action. Depending on what you need, depending on your diagnosis, you can go to any of those stages in the process. And so folks who've been through programs that New and Improved has delivered, you've seen these articulations of the process, at least if you've been through in the last few years. If you haven't been through a New and Improved program, you've probably seen a creative problem-solving process or a creative process that looks very similar. Like if you've been through the Creative Problem Solving Institute, you've seen something similar. So that's sort of the traditional, if you will, approach to creative problem solving and creative process. And then I guess the important question that comes out of that, So, Gerard, you and Mary and Marie sort of created a new version of the model that you guys call the thinking skills model that focuses on how leaders develop these skills. So I'm going to ask you to sort of tell us a little bit about that and why there's a need for a different way of looking at something, since the process has been around in various forms for 60 years or so.
Exactly, and obviously you're going to see as an expression of the creative process, as a version of creative problem solving, you're going to see a lot of similarity to your own work, Jonathan, and those who are familiar with your work primarily will see similarity. So I'm going to dive into this and kind of unpack our approach in terms of the thinking skills model. I don't believe that it departs so radically from what you have that it'll sort of sound like a completely foreign language, but it has enough similarity and difference to kind of add some value, I believe, to what folks have been exposed to. So the thinking skills model, if you look sort of at the natural expression of the creative process, cognitive psychologists, when you have people presented with a problem and you follow their thinking and you organize their thinking, there's a natural flow to it. And that natural flow is expressed in the creative process that Jonathan described. The way that we express it is to think about three main areas of operation. So you have to spend some time clarifying, clarification. So what's the situation? What are the challenges? What are the issues? What are the main problems that need to be addressed? Then you move into an area of thought, the green area. We call it transformation. Here's where you're transforming your thinking from producing potential ideas into more robust solutions. So we're transforming ideas into solutions. So we're going from good ideas to great solutions. That's why we call it transformation. And then if you proceed along in sort of a natural process, the next question one would ask oneself is, okay, so we have these terrific solutions. What do we need to do to execute them and begin to think about the rollout? That's the implementation stage of the creative process. So, to that, we add in this element, and Jonathan, you referred to it in your description in terms of that in the spoke and hub, the diagnose. So we have an area that we call assessing the situation, and we suggest actually that all creative processes and problem-solving efforts, whether you're reacting to a situation, a predicament has presented itself, or you have a sense that there's an opportunity and it's something that you are contemplating pursuing, you start with understanding the present situation and where the predicaments and opportunities are. This is what we delve into first. This is the beginning of the thinking skills model, is stepping back, assessing the situation, asking yourself about the key data in that situation, and ultimately what the goal is in terms of resolving that. So we call that assessing the situation in which we gather data, and then we make a decision about where to go into the creative process. So we don't assume that you always begin with clarification. If the problem is well-defined and it's clear and there's consensus that the root challenge has been identified, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to revisit clarification. One can move into immediately the transformation stage in terms of generating ideas and then turning those ideas into solutions. Or if one were to assess the situation and say, gosh, we're really committed to this change, this proposed new idea, we don't really need to revisit this, and we know what challenge we're solving, really where we want to enter the thought process is in implementation, you can move directly to implementation. So imagine, this is not animated, but use your imagination and imagine that pointer in the center were to spin. And essentially that's what's happening. You're assessing the situation and then pointing to the step of the process which makes the most sense to then go into to be most efficient in applying your creative thinking. So there are specific steps. We'll go one more layer in. Before we do that, though, those familiar with the creative process a la what New and Improved teaches and has gone through programs at Creative Education Foundation or at Buffalo State are familiar with this notion of separating divergent and convergent thinking. And the hallmark of creative problem solving has always been, for 50 years, is to separate these two forms of thinking, the divergent searching for many alternatives, creating a menu, diverse menu of options, getting outside the area of familiarity, really deliberately stretching one's thinking through extended effort, getting into novelty, and then shifting and beginning to focus and converge, select, and support. So the same hallmark, the same core aspect is true in the thinking skills model. So now to go into the final level layer of the thinking skills model. So we move from assessing the situation and determining where we need to enter into the process, which helps to make this a very flexible process, to a stage. So we say, gosh, we need to clarify. There's consensus around that. The next question is, which step in clarification should you be in? Exploring the vision. Do you really know what the goal is, what the desired end is? If you do, but you're not sure what the challenges are, then you can move into formulating the challenges. In each stage of the thinking skills model, we move from a more, if you will, global step to a more concrete step. That's why you see the words, the oscillating back and forth between the words exploring and then formulating. So we come to consensus around what the vision is, then we formulate the challenges, what stands between us and the ability to achieve this vision. We call those challenges. Once you've satisfied that, you can move into transformation, which has two steps: exploring ideas. So what ideas, concepts can we come up with to address the challenges? Once we have converged on which ideas seem most promising, then we formulate. We form those into solutions. Once we have our solutions, and this is, I think, one difference between some of the previous models around creative process and creative problem solving is in the red phase, or it kind of looks washed out, this pink that you see on your screen, implementation, we begin there by exploring acceptance. And this is one of the reasons why we think of the creative process and the thinking skills model as sort of under the broad umbrella of a change model. If you're going to do something new, if you've exited the formulating solutions with something that's a novel concept, let's face it, novel ideas are not always warmly embraced. So we spend some time beginning to scan the context and thinking about what do we have to do to build in acceptance. Who's going to assist? Who's going to resist this? Who are the key stakeholders? Where are those key stakeholders? How do we get them on board with this proposed change or this solution? And often it requires a lot of imagination at that point. And then finally, that feeds into, after exploring acceptance, it feeds into now concretizing a plan, formulating a specific plan to ensure success.
That's great. So, Gerard, so you've really spent time talking about the need for creative thinking and the need for innovation, and yet I kind of find myself thinking, well, geez, we've used this other model for the last 60 years or so in various forms. So why bother with a new approach? Why bother with the thinking skills model? What does it add to the party, I guess, is what's new, useful, and innovative about it?
Added value, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it shares a lot in common, as you said, but I think there are some, or as I said earlier, some important points of differentiation. One of the things which I've not gotten into, which I'll get into next, and someone might be thinking out there, well, these guys call it the thinking skills model, but you haven't talked about that. So what? One of the differences is that as we took this on, based on our experience and some research, and Laura Barbero-Svitolsky was really invaluable here, in terms of combing through the literature and then using subject matter experts. One of the things that thinking skills model, it goes into articulation of the skills associated with the creative process. So when you're learning the creative process, people who've gone through your programs or through our graduate program often will say, and I'm sure you get this all the time, wow, this was really transformative. It just really opened my eyes, and this is kind of helped to transform who I am. Well, just learning a model doesn't do that. It's the skills, it's the attitudes that one takes on as a result of learning that creative process that really is transformative. So what we've done is we've articulated, not all, but what we think are some of the major skills that are influenced through learning the creative process or creative problem solving. And on the left-hand side, you have the thinking skills. Assessing the situation helps to develop diagnostic thinking. So being able to step back and to think in a metacognitive way, to stand above the fray and say, gosh, I'm being challenged by this situation. What's the most appropriate action here? What's the most appropriate way of engaging in this task? And literally, it's the ability to think about your thinking, which many people don't do. They kind of dive in and kind of immerse themselves immediately in coming up with a solution. Mindfulness in the right-hand column relates to the affective skills. So what we've tried to do is unpack when you're learning the creative process, when you go through training with New and Improved, when you go through a training program or educational experience through Buffalo State College International Center for Studies and Creativity, what specifically are the skills that you're honing and developing? And the right-hand side, you have the affective side. And one of the nuances to the thinking skills model is that we look at, to be effective at the creative process requires both highly honed thinking skills as well as affective skills, because affect, with all the talk about emotional intelligence and what a role feelings and emotions and affect play in terms of our effectiveness, we have to recognize that, for example, in the exploring the vision step of the process, if you go to the second layer down here, requires visionary thinking to engage in literally the ability to imagine in pictures the future. But gosh, if you can't dream of possibilities, that's the affective side of the coin. It's going to shackle your visionary thinking. So one of the differences in terms of the thinking skills model is we articulate specifically, as a result of learning creative process and creative problem solving, this is the skill set that you walk away with. So some other points of differentiation, or to the way you phrase it, Jonathan, where do we add value here? Along that line, I think as a result of articulating the skill sets, we can begin to broaden training and development activities relative to creative process. So, for example, once someone has learned from a leadership perspective the creative process or creative problem solving, are they getting sufficient coaching? More on sort of the affective side, to support the risk taking and trying out these new skills, and as well in training, not only focusing on the cognitive side, but to bring in more the affective skills as part of training. So it broadens training approaches.
So if I could ask you to go back 2 slides to that chart, Gerard. So if I understand that second point, what you're saying is that this then sort of says that if you're really good at, you're talking about visionary thinking, sort of the dreaming is the skill that's necessary for good visionary thinking? Is it chicken and egg? You get better at one, you get better at the other? Or?
It's yin and yang, yeah. What we're saying that they're coupled. So if you just strictly learn a strategy, a tool, using wish statements, generating wish statements when trying to picture the future, well, you could do that by learning that tool, but you also have to, on the affective side, nurture the emotion of dreaming. And we think of these as abilities, that they can be nurtured. I know New and Improved, you use a lot of experiential learning exercises, and I think those kinds of exercises, as opposed to drilling and practicing tools, those experiential exercises begin to push on more the affective. How many times gosh, I've heard this, hey, so-and-so went through that creative process training, but damn, they're not using a bit of it. Well, probably because some of the emotional stuff, the emotional intelligence sorts of qualities aren't in place, to embrace it.
Good, thanks.
Yep. So one of the things in terms of the thinking skills model, and especially with the idea of beginning with assessing the situation, it begins to highlight the flexibility of the creative process and really underscores that. So it moves it from a mechanical 1, 2, 3 linear kind of process more to a meta model. And I like to argue that creative problem solving, creative process has lots of layers to it. You don't have to be applying all 6 steps or 7 steps to be using creative problem solving. You can use it in a meeting. So you're running the meeting, and as the person managing that meeting, you can kind of be listening into that meeting and kind of think about, gosh, we're really stuck with, we're leaping to solutions, and gosh, I really don't think we've done a good job in formulating what the challenges and the problems are. So you kind of begin to stand above and process and think about, especially when groups are engaged in the creative process where they're searching for solutions or they're problem solving, you begin to use it to kind of manage your own thinking, and as a leader to manage the thinking of a group. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and Gerard, so you use the phrase meta model. What is a meta model?
So literally, meta means to stand above, to use this to structure your own thinking. So again, kind of what derails meetings? I'm sure many of us have been in unproductive meetings. Well,
once or twice.
Once or twice, and if anyone says they haven't been, I want to trade my life with that person, having come from a chairs meeting this morning. So,
sorry.
So meta means, or the dean this morning says, hey, we have this challenge, we have this huge budget deficit that we have to close, and immediately the group begins to generate ideas and then quickly converge on one to implement. Well, you know, in fact, the dean did this morning. He said, well, you know, guys, I hear us really going down the road towards this specific solution, but let's step back because it's probably premature to close down too quickly. Let's continue to explore because I really want to make sure this is a big problem. I want to make sure we have lots of ideas before we converge too quickly. So it's that ability, although he wasn't deliberately using creative process, he was able to step back and say, let me kind of manage this meeting and this discussion a bit better. And I would argue that people who learn creative process through New and Improved and who learn the thinking skills model through us should be carrying around, you should be assessing the situation all the time and making adjustments in interactions one-on-one with others as you're coaching them or in conducting a meeting where you're able to stand back and say, okay, using this as a meta framework, let me use this kind of like a GPS to locate where we are and now where we need to recalibrate. So hopefully that's clear. So then the last point here is significantly widens the toolkit based on skills. Actually, this kind of ties into the meta model. By articulating the specific skills, so going back to the specific skills, especially the thinking skills involved in the thinking skills model, it opens up the model to many more tools. So, for example, tactical thinking. So you say the kind of skill that's valuable and necessary to formulating the plan is tactical thinking. Well, gosh, then that opens up the creative process to let's start pulling in project management tools, for example. Let's use this as a meta model to be much more open about what are all the tools that maybe people have been exposed to that fit into this model that can be used to engage in that kind of thinking. So once taught, like New and Improved teaches its model, you have a particular toolkit. What I'm suggesting is that there are many other tools that are out there that fit in, that can be drawn into the creative process once you think of it as a kind of a meta framework. And I think that was the last one on that. So another an important point of departure is this point here, and this brings it back to leadership. So we view when we teach creative process or creative problem solving, we're teaching an important leadership skill. And we see 4 levels of development, with the highest level of development in terms of taking on the creative process. And that's what we refer to as a creative change leader. So someone who creatively brings about or inspires as a catalyst for new approaches, whether they're adaptive or innovative. And at the highest level of development, it's where someone has embraced creative process to such a degree it becomes unconscious. It just becomes a natural part of who they are. And I would suggest that's where the greatest impact is. So when you have someone who's gone through training with New and Improved or through our graduate program, if they have made this second nature, they've internalized these skills, both the cognitive and the affective. You don't really internalize a tool. You internalize the principles behind it, the skills behind it. That's when you start to create a culture. in an organization or in a team that is truly innovative. So that's our highest goal, is to get people to the point where they don't have to pull out the cheat sheet or the flow diagram, that in a conversation, one-on-one with someone, a direct report who comes to them with a problem, they immediately, second nature, begin to use a facilitative leadership approach, if you will.
Nice. Good. So, so we said that we were going to reserve the last 10 minutes for questions. We are at the 10-minute mark, and fortunately, one of those questions tees up this next part very nicely. The question, Gerard, so you referenced Motorola earlier, and so the question is, so most recently, and I'm reading this now, Motorola has split into two companies and seems to have pulled back from active involvement with new innovation, or at least that's sort of what it seems like. Are there any studies out there that sort of talk about how innovation is really translated into actions in the workplace of those corporations? Any studies that really talk about what's innovation look like, and how do you really drive more innovation into the workplace?
Yeah, there was a study that came out in California Management Review a couple of years ago that looked at two things: what's the financial return on innovation, and how do you inspire innovation? And they clearly showed that the most innovative organizations, they had something like 300 firms, clearly enjoyed more market share, greater return on assets compared to a pool of companies that were identified as being less innovative. And then when they looked at what was going on in those organizations, they found that they were creating new knowledge, that they were applying imagination, but also using consensus to come to decisions. And then another study that, actually I'll cite two quickly, another study around leadership showed that, this is with several hundred firms looking at executives. These were multinational companies who had an expat that was running the organization. They looked at 5 leadership practices using direct reports evaluation of the executives, and what they found was that the more innovative the leadership approach and style, the more that translated into innovative products and services, and also thinking internally business models, and that those organizations were netting greater profit. So there's some really good concrete studies out there that underscore the innovation, importance of innovation, and the bottom line impact of that. And if you look at the slide that I just brought up, we did a study recently with Nate Schwegler looking at a creative leadership program that we deliver inside of a local multinational company here in Buffalo, and we did critical incident interviews with the people who went through, the managers who went through that training program. You see some of the key outcomes, and one of the things that we looked at was the financial impact of these critical incidents, in which they were using some of the principles or tools that they had learned. And these are rough estimates, and we're following up on these estimates now, but based on these critical incidents, the 15 interviewees that we talked to, when we total up the financial, either cost savings or profit, was in the neighborhood of $6 million. So another example. Nice. Yeah.
And then, and especially when you compare that, that $6 million to, you have now, this is now the $6 million. Are you the $6 million man for coming up with this? You and Nate are the
flashback. Yeah.
Well, since you and Nate Schwegler did this, really, you're a $3 million man. Anyways, so if you take a look at that $6 million compared to the cost of the actual program, the training, the cost for delivering it, the cost for people to sit in it, I'm guessing the return on investment in there is pretty substantial.
Substantial, yeah. In fact, I came across an interesting line, another study that looked at creativity and innovation, in which they looked at is there payoff for adopting organizational mechanisms. Earlier it cited 5% of the 86% of organizations that have innovate or innovation in their mission statement have actual organizational practices. And a study that looked at organizational practices versus, hey, let's just hire creative individuals and turn them loose. Well, they found out that organizational mechanisms are much more successful because when an organization adopts a specific systematic approach, what it says to the employees is, gosh, this company is serious. So it has many benefits, but the concluding comment in the study was that this these organizational mechanisms shouldn't be looked at as an expenditure, but they should really be viewed as an investment, to your point.
Nice. Which actually, Gerard, tees up the next question quite nicely, which is, so talking about the sort of the systematic mechanisms, how do you guide a manager to create an atmosphere of creativity? And the part two to the question is, can a subordinate encourage this behavior? So again, how do you guide a manager to create an atmosphere of creativity, and then can a subordinate encourage this behavior as well?
Well, in terms of subordinate, we think about leadership broadly. It's not just about position, power, or an assigned role, because we can all shape opinion through our ideas. We can influence the context through our own expression. So, one of the interesting, I'll keep this slide up because if you go next up from the financial impact, one of the things that and I give credit to Nate Schwegler on this, that in this organization we found that what was occurring, because now we've had some 140 people that have gone through this creative leadership training, they're beginning to form micro cultures. So these folks are kind of banding together to support one another and reinforcing the skills. So in other words, it's sort of the tipping point. So to your point, do you have to be in that position? No, but it can be accelerated if you have a particular tipping point that begins to sway and create these micro cultures.
Yeah, nice. Good. So, and I guess we've got time for, I think, maybe two more questions, depending on this one. It's a question. Most critical thinking skills models have reflection as a major component. Where do you see reflection fitting into the thinking skills model, Gerard?
Great. Well, that wasn't an area that I touched on, but it's one of the things that we emphasize in the book Creative Leadership. We talk about principles that help one to engage in divergent thinking and principles that help one to engage in convergent thinking or evaluation, focus, synthesis. Well, we have a wild card principle we call allow for incubation. And we think that, and it's been well documented, although debated in terms of how it actually works, but nonetheless, lots of anecdotal examples and examples in laboratory studies that show the value of reflection, both in terms of helping to come up with a new breakthrough, as well as to kind of sitting on and contemplating the change or the decision that you're about to make. So there's clearly value in that, and it kind of ties into the creative climate in terms of allowing for idea time, simply time to reflect. That whoever raised that question is right on target in terms of the importance of that, and we do draw that into the thinking skills model.
Nice. Very good. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left, so let me just wrap up by Gerard thanking you very much. As always, this has been just fascinating. So much good information, so much new stuff, and the depth of research that you can really bring to our practice is hugely valuable. So thank you very much for taking the time to create this presentation, and take time to speak with us and the audience.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Always a pleasure. We've got up here on the screen some contact information. So if you're interested in following up with Gerard, his phone number and email is up there. If you're interested in a copy of the slide deck, if you send me an email, my address is up there, jvehar@newandimprove.com. If you send me that, I will send out a copy of what that's all about. There will be a recording of this, which will be posted on the blog. And I also want to promote Gerard's book, which is this is the second edition of Creative Leadership, 2011. Which is it quite out yet, or is it coming out in the next couple of weeks?
No, it's out. It's out.
Oh, well,
if you go to Sage or to Amazon. Amazon's probably easier. You can find it
Good.
easily enough.
Sage being the publisher, there is a first edition which is out there. And can you give us the 2-second headline and the differences between second and first edition?
Sure, a lot more depth around leadership in the second edition.
Got it. Great, thanks. So again, my thanks to Denise Morgan, who is the producer of these webinars, our innovation webinar guru. More information is available, as you can see on the screen. And I want to thank you very much for your time, and I want to encourage everyone to go out there and lead creatively, because we need it now more than ever. So with that, we will end the webinar, and we'll leave that contact information up for a couple more minutes. Have a great day, folks.